Imagine a society that's just, completely on the brink of collapse.
Right, like structurally totally frozen.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Arguing for, nearly 50 years over the legal definition of its own citizens.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. The entire governmental apparatus is just caught in this massive ideological whirlpool. It can't move forward because it can't even agree on the fundamental variables of its own existence.
Yeah, the basic math isn't mathing.
Right. And to solve this crisis, this philosopher we're looking at today didn't look at law books. He didn't look at political treaties. He looked up at a thunderstorm.
Which is such a massive pivot.
It really is. So welcome to today's custom-tailored deep dive. We are unpacking a really dense, historically rich, and honestly quite provocative lecture by a thinker named Ghulam Ahmad Parwez.
And this is fascinating stuff.
Oh, absolutely. The core of this material is a highly rationalist, almost mechanical analysis of a specific chapter of the Quran, Surah Ar-Ra'd, which actually translates to thunder.
Right, thunder, which sets the stage perfectly.
Yeah. And our mission today is to see how this text maps the strict, unyielding laws of the physical universe directly onto the rise and fall of human civilizations.
And the paradigm shift that Parwez introduces right at the start is just, well, it's what makes the material so compelling.
How so?
Well, for most of human history, if you ask someone why a foundational religious text would name a chapter after thunder, the answer is purely mystical, right?
Oh, for sure. It's the angry gods trope.
Exactly. It relies on this primal emotional reaction. The sky goes dark, the thunder cracks, the lightning strikes, and the ancient assumption is binary. The gods are angry.
Because humans have this intense psychological need to project our own social structures onto things we don't understand.
Right. Our capacity for vengeance, our anger, our arbitrary punishments, we just project all of that onto the physical atmosphere.
Yeah, bad weather means divine punishment. Good weather means divine favor. It's a very simple equation.
Very simple and deeply human.
But, when I look at that ancient perspective from an engineering standpoint, it's essentially a narrative built around an undefined variable.
Uh-huh.
It treats the universe as this emotional entity that just acts on a whim. But the moment you step into the realm of actual meteorology,
Oh, yeah.
of atmospheric physics, thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, that mystical narrative just shatters completely.
Because the math takes over.
Exactly. Thunder is not a magical punishment. Parwez actually frames it as well. We could call it the universe's alarm clock.
I love that phrase, the universe's alarm clock.
Right. It's a loud, unavoidable physical signal that the rigid laws of chemistry and physics are actively working.
Because thunder is just a byproduct, really.
Yeah, it's the auditory byproduct of immense electrical discharge, heating the air to tens of thousands of degrees in a fraction of a second.
Which causes the air to expand at supersonic speeds.
Supersonic speeds. It's a highly structured mechanism of revival designed to bring life-giving rain out of a completely dry, stagnant, dead landscape.
And understanding those physical laws is like the absolute key to Parwez's entire sociological thesis here.
Right, because he connects the weather to human behavior.
Exactly. He takes these meteorological phenomena and maps them directly onto sociology, economics, history. It's a framework we're going to examine today as social physics.
Social physics, I like the sound of that.
It's super interesting. We are going to look at how a society resolves internal constitutional crises through the lens of thermodynamics.
Which sounds crazy, but it works.
It really does. And we'll redefine a commonly misunderstood linguistic concept about how energy is spent in the universe.
Oh, the word study. That part is wild.
Yeah, it's a huge shift. And finally, we'll analyze the mechanics of ancient civilizations, specifically looking at a monumental engineering failure in ancient Yemen.
The Dam of Saba.
Right, to understand the physical reality of why societies actually collapse.
So before we delve into the physics of the storm, though, we really have to establish the barometric pressure of the society Parwez was speaking to.
Because you can't understand the rain without understanding the drought.
Exactly. You can't grasp the mechanical function of the storm if you don't realize how bad things were. The source material begins with a highly specific, heavily weighted historical moment.
Yeah, September of 1974.
Right. Parwez delivered this lecture then, and he describes this moment quite emphatically as the happiest day of his life.
Wow. That's a strong statement.
It is. And it wasn't a personal milestone. It was a massive, sweeping constitutional shift in Pakistan.
And to really understand this shift, and to objectively study Parwez's argument regarding how a state codifies its ideological boundaries, We have to look at the historical background he provides.
Which is complicated.
Very. And we need to be really clear here for the listener. Parwez had very strong, highly opinionated views on this subject.
Right.
For the purposes of our analysis today, we are looking at this completely impartially.
Absolutely.
Strictly as a study of how a nation-state attempts to resolve an existential crisis of definition.
Yeah, we're looking at the structural mechanics of it, not endorsing the theology.
Exactly. So Parwez traces the root of this 1974 constitutional amendment back to a prolonged crisis between 1926 and 1935.
Which started with a court case, right?
Yeah, a landmark court case in the princely state of Bahawalpur.
Okay, let's examine the mechanics of that 1926 court case, because from a systems perspective, it's fascinating. On the surface, it was just a family law dispute.
Just a local annulment case.
Right. A Muslim woman filed for the annulment of her marriage, arguing that her husband had joined the Ahmadiyya movement, which is often referred to in the source text as the Qadiani movement.
Right.
And her legal argument was that by joining this movement, he no longer met the definition of a Muslim. Therefore, under the personal law applied to them, the marriage was invalid.
And the sociological complexity of this moment in colonial British India is just, it cannot be overstated.
Because it's a massive clash of systems.
Exactly. You have a civil court system built on British common law, suddenly tasked with adjudicating a deep internal theological boundary.
Right.
The judge realized that to issue a ruling on the marriage, the court first had to legally define the parameters of the religion itself.
Which is a huge scope creep for a family court.
Unbelievable scope creep. Specifically, the court had to define what the finality of prophethood entailed in a strictly legal sense, and whether the husband's beliefs placed him outside that boundary.
See, from a systems architecture perspective, the court essentially hit a fatal error in its code right there.
Oh, totally. A blue screen of death.
Exactly. It was asked to process an output, granting or denying an annulment. But the core variable required for the equation was completely undefined in the state's legal framework.
Because there was no constitutional definition.
Right. A court case is a troubleshooting process. You input the dispute, run it through the legal algorithm, and get a ruling. But this specific case jammed the colonial judicial system for 9 years.
9 years for an annulment. And it jammed because the judge, lacking a codified constitutional definition, had to call upon leading religious scholars from all across the Indian subcontinent.
He brought in outside experts.
Yeah, from Deoband, from Bahawalpur, from all these various schools of thought. He brought them into the courtroom to testify on the definition of a Muslim.
Wow.
And this is where we see the clash between traditional, decentralized religious authority and the strict requirements of a modern legal apparatus.
Because they don't speak the same language.
Not at all. In a pre-modern societal setup, religious authority isn't centralized in a parliament. It is dispersed among individual clerics who issue fatwas.
Right, and fatwas are just individual, non-binding opinions based on specific interpretations.
Exactly.
I see that as trying to build this complex suspension bridge, but every single engineer on the project is using a completely different, highly subjective system of measurement.
Oh, what a nightmare.
Right, one engineer is using the metric system, another's using imperial, a third is using some ancient, localized unit of measurement, and they're all submitting blueprints for the exact same load-bearing pillar.
And the judge is just sitting there trying to make sense of the blueprints.
Exactly. The state simply cannot function on a mosaic of conflicting informal opinions. If a state claims an ideological foundation, it requires a defined, unyielding system.
It needs a standard metric.
Yes. It cannot operate with floating, ambiguous variables at its core.
And that structural necessity is precisely why Parwez views the 1974 constitutional amendment as a profound triumph of statecraft.
Because it finally defined the variable.
Yes. In 1974, the Parliament of Pakistan officially codified the definition of a Muslim into the Constitution.
Okay.
This explicitly addressed the finality of prophethood and legally categorized the Ahmadiyya movement as a non-Muslim minority for the purposes of the state's constitution and law.
Right. Again, noting this objectively as a structural change.
Absolutely. Parwez doesn't just view this as a political or theological victory. He argues it as a necessary systemic evolution.
A system upgrade.
Exactly. It was the definitive transition from the chaos of individual varying fatwas to a unified, codified state law.
And he uses a very specific metaphor in the text, doesn't he? He describes the prior 50 years as a whirlpool.
Yeah, a whirlpool, just spinning and spinning.
The state was trapped in this centrifugal spin, expending massive amounts of societal energy debating this issue, but making absolutely no forward progress.
Just burning fuel.
Right. So the 1974 amendment, in his structural analysis, acted as the legal mechanism that finally resolved the ideological variable.
It hard-coded it.
Yes, it took the definition entirely out of the hands of informal, fragmented clerical debate and hard-coded it right into the core operating system of the state.
And, you know, regardless of the deep political and theological sensitivities surrounding the amendment.
Which are immense.
Immense. And the profound human impact of legally redefining a community's status. Parwez's sociological argument is laser-focused on the mechanics of sovereignty.
How the state functions.
Right. He posits that if a state is fundamentally based on an ideological premise, rather than purely geographic or ethnic lines, it must legally and constitutionally define the members of that ideology.
Because otherwise it's just a theoretical concept.
Exactly. Without a legally functional perimeter, the ideology remains merely a concept, totally incapable of being administered by a state apparatus.
So we have this historical baseline. We have a heavy, stagnant societal tension, this 50-year legal and theological drought, and then the constitutional amendment acts as the sudden, violent thunderclap that breaks the tension and forces a new reality.
Which perfectly sets up his jump into the Quranic analysis.
Right. This moment of resolving a systemic crisis serves as Parwez's launchpad into Surah Ar-Ra'd. He pivots from asking how human societies require strict, codified laws to function, to asking how the universe itself governs change.
Because if human laws require absolute definition, what are the absolute definitions of universal law?
Right, and he bridges that gap through a brilliant, highly granular linguistic analysis of a specific Arabic word heavily featured in the text.
How about word tasbeeh?
Tasbeeh, yes. And the way Parwez redefines this single word completely alters the trajectory of how we understand human effort versus natural law.
It really does, because the traditional understanding of tasbeeh is almost entirely passive.
Yeah, if you ask someone on the street what it means or observe how it is practiced in many traditional settings, a very specific static image comes to mind.
You picture someone sitting quietly.
Completely isolated from the friction of the world, just sitting there holding a string of rosary beads.
Right.
They repeat a specific phrase of glorification, mathematically counting it out. 33 times, 100 times, 1,000 times.
Like a transaction.
Exactly like a transaction. It's treated as a numerical input, like a spiritual vending machine.
A spiritual vending machine.
If I input this acoustic phrase exactly 100 times, I will unlock a specific magical reward or ward off a specific physical danger.
And Parwez fiercely attacks this rosary bead interpretation. He really goes after it.
He does not hold back.
No, he critiques this mathematical, magical formula approach to faith as a profound distortion of the text. He traces the concept of numerical repetition back to ancient numerology.
Oh, right, the superstition stuff.
Yeah, this deeply rooted human superstition where odd and even numbers were assigned mystical properties of good and bad luck.
Like, doing it 99 times is good, but 100 is bad, or whatever.
Exactly. He argues that the physical universe simply does not operate on a magical quota system where the passive repetition of syllables somehow alters the laws of thermodynamics or sociology.
Which, as an engineer, makes total sense to me. I mean, if the structural integrity of a skyscraper is failing because the steel beams are corroding, sitting in the lobby and chanting the word metallurgy 100 times will not help the oxidation process.
It's not going to fix the rust.
No. The universe demands physical kinetic action to counter physical decay. Parwez strips away all that mystical baggage and looks at the true etymological roots of the word tasbeeh in classical Arabic.
And the imagery he uncovers is so intense.
It's entirely grounded in the kinetic physical world.
Yeah, the Arabic root provides two primary vivid illustrations. Originally, among the desert Arabs, the root of tasbeeh described a galloping horse.
But not just any horse.
Right, crucially, not a horse casually trotting or pacing itself. It described a horse moving at its absolute maximum physical capacity, a dead gallop, or what is termed sarpat.
Just giving it everything.
Yes. And the second usage describes a swimmer in the water.
Which, again, is not a leisurely float.
Not at all. It's not a person treading water. It describes a swimmer engaged in absolute maximum effort, thrusting their arms forward, utilizing every ounce of muscular strength and lung capacity to reach a specific destination across a current.
Holding absolutely zero energy back in reserve.
None. Maximum output.
I interpret that through the lens of physics as the total unyielding application of directed kinetic energy. It is what I would call systemic compliance.
Systemic compliance. Tell me more about how you see that.
Well, think about a piece of high-performance machinery, like the turbine blades inside an aerospace jet engine. Those blades are subjected to extreme heat and centrifugal force. When they operate exactly as engineered, perfectly channeling the airflow to generate maximum thrust without wasting energy as excess heat or vibration, that engine is in systemic compliance.
It's doing exactly what it was built to do.
Exactly. It is fulfilling its structural purpose flawlessly. Parwez notes the Quran states that everything in the heavens and the earth performs tasbih.
Right.
So, the sun moving through space, the bird in flight, the thunder echoing in the clouds, they are not counting beads.
No, they are perfectly executing the unyielding physical laws embedded in their creation.
Yeah.
Like, a star is in a state of constant, violent, flawless nuclear fusion. That is its tasbih.
That's a great example.
A storm cloud perfectly executes the laws of atmospheric pressure and electrical discharge. They are in a state of tireless maximum effort toward their natural physical purpose. They don't deviate, and they don't hoard their energy.
Let me challenge the application of this concept, though.
Go for it.
Because I understand systemic compliance for a star. I understand it for a horse, a swimmer, or a jet engine. Those are physical bodies moving through physical space, governed by biology, chemistry, and physics.
Right.
A star doesn't have a choice in performing nuclear fusion. But human beings have agency.
Yes, we do.
So if the thunder follows its law perfectly, and that is tasbih, how does a human construct something abstract like a political framework or a macroeconomic system perform tasbih? How do you measure the galloping horse of an economy?
That is the exact pivot Parwez makes from the physical universe to social physics.
Okay.
Human beings possess free will, which means we have the unique capacity to build systems that either actively defy universal laws or intentionally align with them.
We can choose to build a bad engine.
Exactly. A human system performs tasbih when its structural design and its daily operation align perfectly with universal laws of equity, sustained effort, and justice.
So it's about the design of the system.
Yes. When a human system works tirelessly, without holding back resources, toward the preservation and elevation of humanity, it is in systemic compliance.
Okay, to put an engineering framework on that, let's look at how energy moves. In a closed thermodynamic system, if energy pools in one area and creates a massive thermal disparity, the system becomes highly volatile and inefficient.
Like overheating.
Yes. We have to engineer cooling systems to circulate that heat, or the machine literally destroys itself.
Right.
If we map that to a human economy, an economy performs tasbih when it acts as an active circulation mechanism.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Wealth and resources must flow through the societal ecosystem to nourish all components, much like blood flowing through a body or water circulating through a biosphere.
Precisely. If a society engineers an economic system where labor is rewarded equitably, where monopolies and exploitation are systematically minimized, and where the aggregate effort of the state is focused on elevating the human condition, that system is galloping at full speed.
It's the swimmer using maximum effort.
Exactly. Conversely, if a society builds an economy based on artificial scarcity, where wealth is hoarded in stagnant pools by a tiny fraction of the population, while the rest are deprived of basic nourishment,
that system is actively breaking the universal law of circulation.
it is completely out of systemic compliance, and physics dictates that a system out of equilibrium will eventually face a violent correction.
So under Parwez's definition, tasbih is the exact opposite of passive meditation.
100%.
It is an active, exhausting, relentless pursuit of structural alignment with the laws of nature. If you are not designing, building, and maintaining equitable systems with maximum physical and intellectual effort, you are not performing tasbih, regardless of your personal piety.
Right, doesn't matter how many beads you count.
Exactly. It is the difference between sitting on the riverbank, hoping the bridge holds the weight of your train, versus doing the grueling mathematical calculations, pouring the concrete, and stress testing the steel cables. The universe only respects the latter.
And this active, kinetic interpretation of effort sets the perfect stage for Parwez's analysis of the storm metaphor itself.
Because the storm is kinetic energy.
Yes. Because if everything in the universe is governed by an unyielding physical law of action, reaction, and energy transfer, then the components of the storm in Surah Ar-Ra'd, the thunder and the lightning, are not random anomalies. They are the inevitable mechanical consequences of a specific buildup of atmospheric energy.
Which brings us to the visual data of the storm. We've established the auditory component, the thunder acting as the alarm clock, the shockwave of change. Now we have to analyze the flash.
The lightning.
Right. In the text, lightning, or sanika, is heavily featured. And Parwez strips away the mystical dread surrounding the lightning strike and reframes it as the spark of intellectual insight.
While still acknowledging how dangerous it is.
Yes, while simultaneously addressing the very real, lethal physics of electricity.
Parwez uses a highly specific and honestly somewhat satirical anecdote in his lecture to highlight human irrationality here.
I love this part.
He describes a scenario where a massive, towering building is suddenly struck by lightning. Perhaps property is heavily damaged, or someone is tragically injured.
Which happens.
Right. And he notes that the immediate instinctual reaction of the crowd gathering around the rebel is to cry out, "God struck this building. It is divine will."
They make it personal.
Yes. They interpret the physical event as a targeted emotional assassination by the universe.
And from an engineering perspective, that reaction is a complete abdication of human responsibility.
How so?
Well, when I look at a massive skyscraper that has just taken a direct lightning strike, I don't see a target of divine wrath. I see a catastrophic code violation.
A code violation?
Yes. The physics of lightning are remarkably straightforward. You have millions of volts of static electricity building up in the storm clouds due to the friction of ice and water particles.
Right, just massive energy buildup.
And that negative charge is desperately seeking the path of least electrical resistance to ground itself in the earth.
It just wants to ground out.
Exactly. If you, as a human architect, decide to build a towering structure of steel and concrete that reaches up into that electrically charged atmosphere, and you completely fail to install a simple lightning rod.
Which is just a conductive copper wire.
It is a wire designed to safely channel that current into the ground. If you fail to do that, then the laws of physics dictate that a destructive strike is not just possible, it is mathematically highly probable.
In Parwez's point is that the universe doesn't possess an emotional vendetta against the owner of the building.
No.
The universe is simply obeying the unyielding laws of electrical conductivity. By ignoring those laws, the human builders provided a path of resistance through their ungrounded structure, and the electricity violently forced its way through.
And that maps incredibly well onto the sociological behavior of human civilizations in crisis.
Oh, perfectly. Think about the infrastructure of a society. When a nation experiences a sudden destructive shock, a total economic collapse, a violent civil uprising, a massive failure of public health.
The storm hits.
Exactly. The instinct of the leadership and the populace is often to blame bad luck, external enemies, or a divine test. It is a way to avoid looking at the structural blueprints.
They don't want to admit they didn't build a lightning rod.
Exactly. Parwez's logic demands that we interrogate the societal infrastructure. Did the society build lightning rods? Did they engineer safety nets to catch the vulnerable during an economic downturn?
Did they have grounding mechanisms?
Right. Did they maintain an equitable justice system to address grievances before they turned to violence? Did they foster open communication channels and a free press to ground the building tensions of the populace safely?
If they didn't.
If a society fails to build those grounding mechanisms and instead allows inequality and injustice to accumulate like a massive static charge in the atmosphere,
then the uprising is inevitable.
the eventual violent uprising isn't a mysterious twist of fate. It is just the physics of society playing out its inevitable conclusion. The destructive strike was guaranteed by the negligence of the architects.
The text pushes even deeper into the human psychology of facing these moments of violent discharge, too. Parwez analyzes a very specific Quranic phrase associated with lightning, Khawf and Tama.
Which translates roughly to fear and hope.
Right. When you see that brilliant, jagged flash of lightning in a darkened sky, it simultaneously triggers two opposing psychological states.
Because on one hand, it brings acute fear.
You realize you might get hit.
Yes. It is a realization of the immediate physical danger of the strike, the risk of fire, destruction, and shock to the existing structures.
Right.
But simultaneously, that exact same flash of light brings profound hope. It is the undeniable meteorological promise that the heavy, life-giving rain is imminent.
The rain that's going to fix the drought.
Exactly. The rain that will break the suffocating heat, water the dying crops, and bring the dead earth back to life. From a sociological standpoint, Parwez suggests this dual nature of fear and hope is the core engine of all human progress.
I look at Khawf and Tama as the ultimate articulation of the risk-to-reward ratio.
Okay, unpack that.
Well, in any massive engineering project, any groundbreaking scientific endeavor, or any profound social revolution, you must calculate this ratio.
You have to weigh the odds.
Yeah. If you want the reward, the cure for a devastating disease, the harnessing of a new limitless energy source, or the establishment of a truly democratic constitution, you must accept the risk.
You have to face the storm.
You cannot have the life-giving rain without surviving the turbulence of the heavy clouds and navigating the highly dangerous electrical spark of change.
And every massive societal paradigm shift is preceded by a flash that is both terrifying and exhilarating. The fear of the unknown, the fear of the old, familiar structures collapsing, even if those structures were oppressive, is incredibly powerful.
Change is scary, even when it's necessary.
Absolutely. But it must be matched and ultimately overcome by the hope of a revitalized, more equitable world.
Right.
Parwez's rationalist framework advocates that we should not cower from the lightning and just, pray for the storm to miraculously dissipate. We must understand the physics of the impending change.
We have to get ready for it.
Yes. We must manage the fear through rigorous structural preparation, building the lightning rods, fortifying the foundation so that when the storm hits, we survive the shock and fully realize the hope of the subsequent rain.
So how do these exact physical laws, this demand for systemic compliance, this requirement to balance the risk-to-reward ratio, this necessity of grounding societal tension, how does all of that map onto the grand sweep of human history?
This is where we get into the applied stuff.
Right. How do civilizations actually fall when they ignore the physics of their own existence? This is where the lecture transitions from theoretical physics to applied social physics.
We move from the thunderstorm to the empire.
Exactly. We watch those mechanics systematically dismantle an entire civilization.
Yeah, Parwez expands the metaphor of thunder to represent the mechanics of societal revolution. He explains that just as atmospheric pressure builds during a prolonged drought, the sociological atmosphere of a nation can become incredibly oppressive.
Like it gets hard to breathe.
Yes. When a society becomes heavily layered with systemic injustice, massive wealth inequality, and political stagnation, it creates a suffocating environment.
Pressure builds.
Eventually, the pressure becomes mathematically untenable. A gentle breeze of minor reform is insufficient to alter the barometric pressure.
A little breeze won't fix a massive heat wave.
Exactly. A thunderous, violent clash of atmospheric fronts becomes the only physical way to break the stagnation.
If you've ever experienced the buildup to a massive summer storm, you know the exact physical sensation. The air is thick, hot, and heavy with humidity. You can barely breathe.
It feels terrible.
It does. The atmosphere is hoarding all this moisture and thermal energy, refusing to release it. Societally, that stagnant humidity represents a culture where wealth and power are aggressively hoarded at the top of the pyramid.
And justice is totally inaccessible to the base.
Right. The legal codes are rigid and designed only to protect the hoarders. The pressure compounds year after year.
And counting rosary beads won't help.
No. Passing superficial performative legislation will not lower the societal barometric pressure. You need a massive kinetic release of energy to force the rain to fall.
However, Parwez introduces a vital caveat here, invoking what he calls the law of requital.
The law of requital. What's that?
This is essentially Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction applied to human morality and collective effort.
Okay, action and reaction.
The Quran explicitly mentions that the divine law raises the heavy clouds. And this begs a critical sociological question regarding the mechanisms of change. How does the law of requital ensure that only the heavy substantive clouds actually produce the rain of revolution?
Because if you look at the sky, or if you look at the political landscape, there are plenty of clouds that make a lot of noise, look incredibly ominous, but ultimately just blow over and dissipate.
They all bark and no bite.
Right. They produce no rain whatsoever. They're physically empty.
Precisely. Parwez argues that superficial actions within a society are like those thin, wispy clouds.
Empty politics.
Empty, performative politics, shallow economic reforms that don't address the root infrastructure, or the mere verbal repetition of religious or political slogans. These actions might temporarily obscure the sun and create the illusion of impending change.
But they don't have the mass.
Right. They lack the molecular density required to actually precipitate. Only heavy, substantive effort, true Tasbeeh, the galloping horse, the maximum kinetic output of the swimmer accumulates enough density to bring about genuine societal change.
You can't fake it.
A civilization cannot fake its way out of an existential structural crisis. The physics of change require immense mass and sustained momentum.
And to vividly illustrate this concept of social physics, Parwez devotes a significant portion of his lecture to a deeply analytical historical case study.
The People of Saba.
Yes, he examines the rise and catastrophic fall of the People of Saba, located in ancient Yemen. And from an engineering and systems perspective, this is the most fascinating part of the entire deep dive.
It's a tragic story, but a perfect model.
Because it perfectly models how a society collapses, not from external conquest, but from the internal neglect of its own physics.
So the historical baseline for the People of Saba is one of absolute mastery over their environment. They were an agricultural and engineering powerhouse in the ancient world.
They really were?
They achieved this prosperity by successfully harnessing the physical forces of their harsh, arid landscape. They constructed one of the most incredible feats of ancient engineering, the Dam of Marib.
An amazing structure.
By brilliantly calculating the hydrology of the region and controlling the massive flow of seasonal floodwaters, they terraformed a desert into an absolute paradise.
The text mentions the gardens, right?
Yeah, the source text describes their civilization as having lush gardens on the right and the left, heavy with fruit. It was a society characterized by immense sustainable prosperity and security.
Let's look at the mechanics of what they actually achieved, because it's mind-blowing. The Dam of Marib wasn't just a pile of rocks. It was a massive gravity dam.
It was highly technical.
Extremely. Utilizing highly sophisticated retaining walls, sluice gates, and a complex network of irrigation canals to distribute water precisely where it was needed across miles of agricultural terraces.
They were in complete systemic compliance.
Yes, they understood the physical laws of hydrostatic pressure and fluid dynamics. They did the grueling mathematical calculations, they engaged the massive labor force required to cut and move the stone, and they built an infrastructure perfectly aligned with the natural laws of their environment.
They did the active Tasbeeh.
Exactly. By actively performing this architectural Tasbeeh, they reaped a massive societal reward. They commanded the flow of water to sustain life.
But sociologies are not static. The text describes a critical, fatal shift in the collective psychology of the society. Parwez refers to it as a brainwave that hit the ruling and merchant classes.
Very dangerous brainwave.
Yeah. They looked at their steady, highly reliable, but seasonally bound agricultural wealth, and they became dissatisfied with the pace of their prosperity.
It wasn't fast enough.
Right. They wanted more wealth, and they wanted it instantaneously. They wanted to become, as the lecture implies, the overnight millionaires of the ancient world.
Which is a classic error in long-term systems planning. Why wait an entire year for the harvest cycle to complete when you can control the rapid velocity of the global supply chain?
Exactly. Trade is faster than farming.
The People of Saba recognized their geographic advantage and decided to pivot their entire macroeconomic focus. They shifted away from local, sustainable, infrastructure-heavy agriculture and aggressively moved toward dominating the highly lucrative long-distance trade routes.
Specifically the incense route connecting the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean.
Right. They transformed themselves from a society of engineers and farmers into a society of middlemen and merchants.
And this macroeconomic pivot fundamentally altered their societal values and their collective focus. When your civilization is built on complex agriculture and hydrology, your daily attention is fixed on the earth.
You're watching the soil, the water.
You are acutely aware of the changing seasons, the rainfall patterns, and most crucially, the structural integrity of your irrigation infrastructure. But when your civilization becomes utterly obsessed with the rapid turnover of long-distance trade, your collective gaze shifts entirely to the horizon.
You're looking out, not down.
Right. You are watching the caravan routes, negotiating with foreign markets, and tracking the accumulation of capital.
And because their eyes were entirely fixed on the horizon, they took their eyes off the dam.
And that's where it all falls apart.
This is the single critical point of systemic failure. Because of this massive shift in economic priorities, they slowly, incrementally, but completely neglected the maintenance of their core infrastructure.
They stopped doing the work.
They stopped sending the engineering teams to inspect the retaining walls. They stopped the grueling, necessary labor of dredging the massive accumulation of silt from the reservoir bed. They stopped reinforcing the mortar where the water pressure was creating microscopic fissures.
The society succumbed to a fatal complacency. They just assumed that the engineered paradise they had inherited from previous generations would simply sustain itself automatically.
Like it was magic.
Yes. They forgot the unyielding, relentless effort, the active Tasbeeh that was physically required to maintain the equilibrium of their society against the constant forces of nature.
And here is where the brutal, unforgiving reality of physics asserts itself.
Because physics doesn't care.
No. The physical laws of hydrostatic pressure possess zero sentimentality. They do not care about the profitability of your trade routes. They do not care how wealthy your merchants have become, how beautifully your markets are decorated, or what your political slogans are.
Water is just heavy.
Immensely heavy. Water has immense mass. Water continuously seeks the path of least resistance. The millions of tons of water resting against the dam of Marib were constantly performing their own physical tasbih,
Just pushing against the stone.
exerting unyielding, mathematically predictable pressure against the stone, day and night, century after century. Furthermore, as they neglected to dredge the reservoir, the silt buildup displaced the water, raising the water level and exponentially increasing the lateral pressure against the upper, weaker sections of the dam wall.
Oh, wow. So the pressure actually got worse because of the neglect.
Exponentially worse.
Yeah.
And water also utilizes capillary action, finding the microscopic cracks in the unmaintained mortar and slowly expanding them over time.
So the collapse, when it finally occurred, was not a slow, manageable leak.
Well,
It was a sudden, catastrophic, systemic rupture. The source text describes how the dam gave way, releasing a torrential, apocalyptic flood that swept everything away.
everything they built.
The centuries of meticulously built agricultural terraces, the lush gardens, the orchards, the infrastructure of their civilization, it was all violently erased. The text notes that all that was left behind in the aftermath were bitter fruit and thorny bushes. The paradise was entirely undone.
Parwez draws a profound, deeply rational conclusion from this historical event, and it serves as the ultimate thesis of his social physics concept. The catastrophic destruction of the people of Saba was not a sin in the mystical, religious sense of capriciously angering a deity who then decided to smite them.
No, not at all.
It was, purely and simply, a crime of structural negligence.
And that distinction is paramount to Parwez's worldview. They were not punished by the universe because they decided to engage in trade.
Right. Trade isn't inherently evil.
They suffered the mathematically inevitable consequence of ignoring the physical laws of nature and abandoning the foundational infrastructure of their society. They failed to perform their systemic compliance, and the system crushed them.
If you engineer a massive stone wall to block the flow of a river, and then you completely walk away, fire your engineers, and let the wall rot, the river is going to eventually tear that wall to pieces.
It's guaranteed.
That is not divine vengeance. That is just gravity and thermodynamics executing their programming. When you physically block water without continuously maintaining the structural integrity of the dam, the water's natural unyielding law will eventually override your neglected, decaying infrastructure.
And the sociological lesson Parwez extracts here is terrifyingly relevant to any complex civilization today.
Right, because we all have dams.
We must constantly ask ourselves, how many modern societies are currently living in the gardens of Saba?
Just enjoying the fruit without doing the work.
Exactly. How many nations are thoroughly enjoying the fruits of complex infrastructure and robust democratic institutions that were painstakingly built by the blood, sweat, and intense tasbeeh of previous generations, while entirely neglecting the grueling maintenance required to keep those systems functional?
It's a huge question.
Whether we're talking about the physical infrastructure, the aging bridges, the vulnerable power grids, the failing water systems, or the vital social infrastructure, the public education systems, the integrity of the courts, the social safety nets, if the relentless, kinetic effort to maintain them stops, the outcome is guaranteed.
The dam will break.
The compounding pressure of societal inequality, combined with the physical decay of the systems, will eventually reach a critical threshold, and yes, the dam will break.
It is the ultimate historical and scientific warning against societal complacency. You cannot outsmart or negotiate with the laws of physics.
You really can't.
And according to the rationalist framework presented in this text, you cannot outsmart the structural laws of human society either.
Yeah.
They're one and the same.
Yeah, that's the core message.
So what does this highly technical analysis of ancient history, atmospheric physics, and constitutional law actually mean for you, the listener? Why should you spend an hour thinking about a 1974 political crisis, the Arabic etymology of a galloping horse, or the hydrostatic failure of a dam in ancient Yemen?
Well, it matters fundamentally because the laws of social physics remain exactly the same today as they were thousands of years ago in the desert.
The math hasn't changed.
No. Whether you are managing the complex logistics of a personal project, leading the strategy of a corporation, or trying to understand the increasingly chaotic landscape of global politics, you are operating within a system governed by unyielding laws.
Actions have consequences.
Actions and, crucially, inactions have precise, mathematically inevitable consequences. Success and survival are based on structural alignment, not magical thinking.
If you're approaching the massive challenges in your life or your society by relying on the equivalent of counting rosary beads, if you are hoping for a successful outcome without putting in the maximum galloping kinetic effort required to achieve it, you're engineering your own failure.
Because systemic compliance requires actual, sustained, grueling effort, both physical and intellectual.
You have to do the math and build the lightning rods before the storm clouds gather.
Yeah.
You have to rigorously maintain the integrity of your dam, inspecting every stone and clearing every ounce of silt, especially when you would much rather be out looking at the horizon, trading for quick profits.
And we must understand the nature of the storm itself. When the storm inevitably comes, when the societal atmosphere becomes suffocatingly heavy, the pressure peaks, and the thunder finally cracks, you have to possess the intellectual insight to recognize it for what it truly is.
It's the alarm clock.
Exactly. The lightning strike of a crisis is not the end of the world. It is the universe's alarm clock. It is the unyielding physical law signaling that the pressure of the status quo has become mathematically untenable and that a violent kinetic change is physically required to bring life and circulation back to a stagnant, dying system.
Which leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought to carry forward.
Okay, lay it on us.
We have spent this entire deep dive meticulously analyzing the mechanics of the build-up to the storm. We've studied the heavy, oppressive atmosphere, the auditory warning of the thunder, the terrifying but hopeful intellectual spark of the lightning, and the structural integrity required to survive the deluge.
Right, all the prep work.
But if the thunder and the lightning are merely the auditory and visual announcements of the universal law at work, what actually happens when the heavy rain finally hits the ground?
Oh, wow. That is the ultimate existential test of any structure or society.
Because the rain does more than just water the plants.
Right, because torrential rain doesn't just nourish the earth. Its primary kinetic function is to wash away the accumulated debris. In the source material, Parwez hints at the next vital phase of this physical analysis.
What does he call it?
He refers to the aftermath of the storm as the true invitation, or dawat al-haq. When the torrential, unyielding rain of truth and physical consequence finally hits the earth, it naturally creates a massive flood.
And in the chaotic physics of that flood, the text outlines a final, universal sorting mechanism.
It sorts the good from the bad.
Yes. The useless foam, the superficial scum, the performative actions that lack the density of true effort, all of it is violently swept away and vanishes, leaving no trace.
But the pure water.
But the pure heavy water, the actual substantive effort that structurally benefits humanity, sinks deep into the bedrock to remain, sustaining the ecosystem for generations.
That's a powerful image.
It is. So the fundamental engineering question for you to mull over today is this. In the complex structures you are building right now in your personal life, in your career, in the civic foundation of your society, are you merely generating light, superficial foam that will be effortlessly washed away by the physics of the next inevitable storm?
Or are you actively cultivating the heavy, substantial water that will survive the flood, sink deep into the earth, and actually nourish the ground? Thank you for joining us on this extensive exploration of social physics. We hope it challenges you to look at the structures around you and the storms gathering on the horizon with a much more analytical, critical eye.
Absolutely. The next time you feel the barometric pressure drop, the sky darkens, and you hear that thunder roll across the sky, don't just write it off as bad weather or bad luck. Think of it as the universe's alarm clock, calling for structural change, demanding systemic compliance, and reminding you that the unyielding laws of nature are always, always at work. Until next time, keep diving deep.